Welcome to another episode of Tag In Talk. My name is Josh. I thank you for swinging by. Today, I want to discuss the hot button, controversial topic of forward-facing sonar. You might be sick of hearing about this by now, and you probably have your well-formed opinions, but I want to share something I don't often hear about. I hear a lot of perspectives from professional anglers, fisheries managers, folks deeply embedded in the fishing industry in one way or the other. What I hear less about is the perspective of the average angler, maybe somebody who is new to angling, who has access and uses forward-facing sonar and how it influences their learning. Let me tell you what I think. So I think the most helpful way for me to lead up to my perspective on forward-facing sonar is to share a little bit of the history I have with the technology and kind of how I learned bass fishing, and I'm still learning bass fishing because I did have forward-facing sonar pretty early on in my bass fishing journey. But if you're totally uninterested in that and want to get to the juicy stuff, feel free to skip all that. I will include a link in the timestamps below, and you can just cut through all my personal nonsense if you'd like. But really quickly, before we get too deep, if you are interested in checking out tackle in a streamlined, simplified way, check out tagintackle.com. We have a President's Day sale going right now through the end of Monday, the 17th, which is President's Day. Everything is 20% off if you use code PRESIDENT25. This is only available to subscribers of our newsletter and now any of you who are watching this video. We have 10% off MSRP all the time on tagintackle.com. We don't try to stock everything out there. We try to stock the baits that we use the most, that we get the most success with. It's always 10% off. Now you get an additional 10% for 20% off anything on the site. Check out tagintackle.com. So I try to be pretty open and upfront about the fact that I do not consider myself any sort of expert fisherman. I am still learning. I got a long way to go. I have only been bass fishing, really targeting bass, for about 7 years or so now, 7 or 8, and got really serious about it about 5 years ago when I got my own boat. So I consider myself a baby in the sport, really, but I am passionate. I love it. I dove in head first. Prior to having my own boat, I would have to go out on other people's boats, like many of us do. So I would go out with Captain Cliff all the time. Now, Cliff had a bass boat with a nice casting deck, and that's where I would generally fish. But Cliff did, and still does, a lot of trolling. And so he rigged up his boat with kind of minimal electronics. And that thing, I think still to this day, only has one fish finder on it at the helm. So Cliff watches that, obviously, as he's trolling to make sure he doesn't run into anything and understands his depth. So on the casting deck, I literally, for a couple years trying to learn bass, had zero electronics, no fish finder. It's still to this day, because I don't think he's added anything up front yet. I have a fish finder for him. I have to look over my shoulder and be like, hey, how deep are we? What's going on down there? I didn't know what I didn't have access to at the time, really, other than the convenience of depth and, kind of some of the basics. But it really taught me to use my eyeballs and see what I'm casting to and read water. Now, that was very natural and comfortable to me because that's how I grew up in the Pacific Northwest for salmon, steelhead, and trout out of our rivers. That was all about wading out there and reading the water. And still to this day, I love that. There's something natural and instinctive about that is at the core of fishing. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. So that's how I started bass fishing. Then I got my own boat. When I get something, I go all in. So I started doing my research about what I need to do to rig up this boat properly. Now, at the time, I was also still doing a lot of trolling and salmon fishing in bigger water. And so I tried rigging it up kind of as a multi-species boat, but didn't really nail it in the beginning. I fixed it later on. But my research led me to Garmin products. When I was doing that research, of course, since it was Garmin, I was introduced to LiveScope. And I will say this to the chagrin and groans of many, I totally understand. And again, I'm just coming across this technology. I didn't hear any of the negativity, any controversy. I don't even know if there was as much at the time. Again, this is 5 years ago now. Video game fishing. This notion of video game fishing really, admittedly, appealed to me because I'm a huge, huge nerd and love video games. Always have ever since just a wee little lad. In fact, I've struggled with my time on video games, and fishing has really helped me get off of the TV and get outdoors, right? Nowadays, I'd rather be fishing, to be frank. But being able to merge these two passions of mine was like a dream come true, right? This idea. So I picked up LiveScope. Now, the boat I bought is a deep V hull aluminum Pacific Northwest style boat, right? They're all over up here. They're your North Rivers, your Aluma-Welds. I mean, they're for the rivers. They're for salmon and steelhead and that kind of thing. They're for whatever, but that's their primary design. So this boat is an open bow boat, and it was a small North River Revenge, a 16-footer that's great for one or two guys. I think they only made them for a couple years. The boats they generally make are far bigger, so this is kind of I don't want to say a rare find, but they're not particularly common. I see a couple out there. But they're not designed for a bunch of electronics and stuff on the bow of the boat. There's no casting deck or anything like that. It's mostly storage, and you get up there and you throw your Columbia River anchor system out. That's kind of what the intended use is and how people typically use them. So I got LiveScope without having any sort of plan about where it might go and how I might get it on. Didn't matter, right? I'm going to get it. I'll figure that out. So ultimately, I had to mount the transducer for the LiveScope near the transom on the port side. And I actually found some YouTube video of a gentleman who had created this PVC contraption pole thing, and I'll try and dig that up and I'll include a link in the description, so that you could independently control your transducer for LiveScope. And I had just spent a ton of money rigging this thing out, so I'm like, great, PVC's cheap, I'll get this up there. And I did that. Now, the problem with that, and those of you that are familiar with forward-facing sonar are probably laughing at me, because now I have a transducer I have to control in the rear port side of the boat. The fish finder, which I only had one at the time, again, it's tough to get electronics to the bow. At the helm, I had a Garmin 93 SV, so small, not the greatest resolution, and we'll talk about that too. And there's no way to like lock in where the transducer is facing, because the way this pipe is created, there's like a pipe inside of a pipe, and it spins freely. So I'm fishing in current a lot. It would move the transducer unless I kept it like one hand on there, keeping it pointed where I wanted it to be pointed. And I'm looking over my shoulder with a rod in one hand and the pole in the other, and it just was not conducive. That is not the way that forward-facing sonar is intended to be used. So ultimately, I had some experiences where I got to see fish. I kind of see like how it should be working. But to be able to actually fish it, I mean, that just was not happening with this setup, right? So I would break out the forward-facing sonar every so often. I had it on a pole that could be detached from a ram mount so I could get it in and out of the boat. Again, multi-species, different purposes. I didn't want this pole hanging off the side of my boat all the time. But it just never really caught on with me, because I knew that I had it installed in a way that just wasn't allowing me to get its full use. And so I kept fishing for several years, old school, if you will, traditional, just looking at depth, using the 2D, the down scan, side scan, getting used to those technologies. And honestly, that was probably pretty good for me to build a foundation of that knowledge and those skills. And that stayed that way until a little over a year ago, actually. So I had forward-facing sonar on this boat for 3-4 years. So what happened a year ago was I started considering investing in a bass boat, something fully equipped. And when I hit the market for that, I realized that now was not the best time for that. And that was going to have to wait a little bit. So instead, I wanted to reinvest in my North River. And so I put some money into it and decided I'm going to figure out how to get this forward-facing sonar set up to where I can actually use it like it's intended to be used. So once I figure that out, again, I'll do a video on how I set up this boat, just in case it's interesting or helpful to anybody else in a similar spot. I got the trolling motor up there. I got a second fish finder up on the bow of the boat, got the trolling motor pedal up there and everything. And then also upgraded my fish finders to 106 SVs, Garmin's, which have way better resolution. I had no idea how different this could all be when it is set up properly and you can actually start seeing things on the screen and manipulating it. So that changed the game for me. Now, I was finally able to start fishing forward-facing sonar the way it was intended and having that video game experience, and it was thrilling to me. So, still is, but right off the bat, I was like, this is great. And it taught me a lot about the fish. That's incredibly important for somebody who didn't grow up around and still doesn't have access to a lot of serious bass anglers and what they've learned over the years. I'm learning on my own. I'm learning through the internet, of course. We have information available to us, right? But still, to get that real-time feedback on how bass respond and react to lures and the circumstances, you get where I'm going with this. You learn so much more quickly. And that was amazing. It was encouraging. It's thrilling. It's awesome. But there was a time not too long after this where I pulled up to a spot and threw it down and it was looking at the screen and thought, is this as fun as it was fishing off the bow of Cliff's boat? Not knowing what's going to happen? Relying purely on my instinct and what I've learned about fish behavior. And in that moment, I realized that I don't want to lose those skills and that knowledge. And so it was a personal decision for me to make sure that forward-facing sonar stayed and remained a tool. And I would say, you know, one of the cool things about it, one of the things, an application recently that it helped me with, I have a personal goal to catch a bass every month throughout the year. And for many of you, that's like, well, okay, no big deal there. But not a lot of folks I know with go out in the winter for bass around here. And I mean, it's just not the primary game fish anyway. But it's really challenging for me to catch bass through the winter, even though so many people on YouTube make it look easy. So it's a goal. I finally had success in December, and I owe a lot of that to having forward-facing sonar on the boat that I could actually use. The point I want to make here is it's not forward-facing sonar alone that brought me success. And I think even to use forward-facing sonar successfully and efficiently, you still have to have some idea of where the fish should be at any given time of the year, whatever their seasonal pattern is, whatever conditions you have going on in the moment. Knowing where the fish should or might be is going to be incredibly helpful because you can show it up to those spots and then kind of verify with the forward-facing sonar. Otherwise, you're just blindly going around the lake or the river. And I don't know that that's going to lead you to much more success, honestly. I mean, theoretically, you can realize you're not in a spot with fish and move on to another one and just hit more spots in a day and therefore increase your chances. Yeah, sure. But that's still not going to make you any sort of great angler, certainly not elite. So I was out on a local lake, side scanning, found some riprap, saw some fish on the 2D down scan, threw down the trolling motor, saw them on the forward-facing sonar, and was able to finally catch a few bass in one spot. Now, normally I see something, some structure, cover, and I see some fish on the 2D, and then they're not on forward-facing sonar. I don't catch anything, right? So it really helped me find that I was in the right place, helped me be effective with my time when it's freezing outside. And you all know how hard it is to stay motivated, and especially if you're not catching anything. Forward-facing sonar was a valuable tool in that situation that helped me find the success and taught me something. So for me personally, I feel that forward-facing sonar has been a net positive addition to my fishing experience and the tools that I have available to me. I do have to make sure that I keep it a tool and don't let it dominate my approach. But I don't really have too much difficulty doing that. And so I'm grateful to have it on my boat. And I feel like I can balance it pretty well. Now, let's talk about the controversial side. So I'm no total expert. I've acknowledged that multiple times now, but I have watched some competitive bass fishing, professional fishing, and I am not a big fan of watching sports in general, but I do watch fishing because it is one of the primary ways in which I learn about bass fishing, like many of you, I am sure. So there seems to be two areas where there are major concerns about forward-facing sonar having a negative impact on fishing, and that seems to be in professional fishing, particularly bass, but also I'm sure walleye. I know walleye, and I'm sure there's some other professional angling areas where this is impacted likely, but I know the most about bass fishing, so that's where we'll focus. And then consumptive fisheries like crappie and similar species. So in the competitive, or I should say professional bass world, it seems like there are kind of two major sub-arguments there. The first being the skill level of the fishermen competing at the elite level, the highest levels, as well as the economic impact on the sport when watching people fish staring at a screen all day is the dominant approach to catching fish in that arena. And that isn't exactly great for spectating. So let's take the spectating part first. So like I mentioned, I don't really care for watching sports anyway. I am one of the folks that agrees that watching fishermen fish vertically while watching their screen doing forward-facing sonar techniques is not exciting. I'll watch it for a minute or two, and after that, I'm done. I'm really only watching a minute or two just to see like how they're doing it, what can I learn. It's not exactly what I would call entertaining. My background is in marketing and business strategy, and so my feelings on that aspect are, look, if it's not what people want to watch, what the argument is that nobody likes it, right? Okay, well, let's see what really happens in the real world. If you're to stick with it and people truly don't want to watch it, they'll stop watching it. The spectator count drops, therefore the electronic sponsors, which is the argument that they're providing the tournament organizations a ton of money, and therefore they're promoting this thing and not banning it, even though it would be better for the sport and bass in general. If there aren't people watching it, the sponsors won't continue to sponsor because they're in business. If they're not getting eyeballs with their advertising dollars, that'll dry up and it'll force a correction. That's my belief. I know the argument is, well, in the meantime, however long that takes for that to happen, you've damaged the sport, you've damaged its positioning in the market, how people think of it. You might also be damaging the fisheries. So that's a valid perspective. And we'll kind of get into that, I suppose, with a consumptive fishing discussion, because it's kind of related to that. So I do get that. I'm sympathetic to that argument that maybe isn't the most entertaining thing to watch. And if you're trying to make money off of any kind of sports, you need to be entertaining. That's where the money comes from. You got to get the eyeballs on it. Otherwise, the advertisers don't want to chip in. So if you're not delivering your product, which is entertainment, you're going to find that out. So I kind of let that play out. That's, I think, where I stand. And again, the impact on the fishery itself, we'll address that in the consumptive part. So the other side is that the anglers competing at the highest levels, what's the best way to put this, are not particularly well-rounded. Now, that's a matter of what you think makes a professional and what you value in a skill set. But I would have to say that I have a sympathy for the argument that more well-rounded anglers should, I don't know if I would say that they would have an advantage, but they should be rewarded on a competitive level for being well-rounded. Personally, I think that the reason that we have sport, the whole reason we have Olympics and all this stuff, I mean, these things are all derived to pay homage to pretty much what we develop as a species for centuries. These are deeply embedded activities that we had to learn and master in order to survive: hunting, fishing, combat in the case of like Olympic sport, for example. These are all derived from activities that we had to be incredibly skilled at in order to survive as a species. So, to completely lose that instinctive side of fishing, that feeling that I got when I was on the bow of the boat, just trying to go, where would a fish be? If I were a bass, where would I be? And not be able to just verify that on a screen as much. And again, clearly I'm not against forward-facing sonar, but that is a shame. And I think the people that do have all of those skills, that they should have a leg up. It should be something that is in part of how we evaluate the true elite of the elite, or how you win a tournament, for example. How do we factor that in so like that's acknowledged and taken into consideration? And I think that's a big question. I don't know that I have an answer for that exactly, but I would say I am sympathetic to, like, if you haven't been fishing very long, and if you were to take your forward-facing sonar away, and if you'd be screwed, I don't know if I personally see that as on the same tier as somebody who could just like, yep, I'm good, I can keep going. Now, I certainly don't want to imply that technology is bad. Clearly not. I am a fan of forward-facing sonar used properly. But more importantly, technology isn't going anywhere. I mean, even if you were to take off forward-facing sonar, like ban that entirely, you still have boats with sophisticated motors that get you across a huge lake at 80 miles an hour. I mean, that just opens up your fishing spot potential massively. I mean, technology is part of the sport. It's part of all of our sports. Frankly, anybody who's competed at the highest levels, who have had more resources than others, which is another argument here, is like you can just buy your way into the elites. I am sympathetic to that, but folks with more money, with more training, I mean, that's just the way it is at the highest tier level of competition pretty much across the board. I don't know that that's unfair. I think the problem is it's a matter of incentives, right? I mean, you were incentivizing in this scenario the use of forward-facing sonar because there's just nothing that competes, right? So I think it's a matter of stepping back and going, what exactly are we incentivizing here? And, I think that's just something we're gonna have to keep an eye on. So I would like to see some solution there. And again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm overly invested in this. I'm not. Tournament angling's fun to watch every now and then. I used to watch it a lot more, but now I'm a little bit more concerned about my own approach to fishing, and I don't know that I'm ever going to be a serious competitive angler. But it is leading the sport. It is important in pushing the boundaries, developing new techniques, new baits. So I want to see it thrive and succeed. And I really hope that we can find a way in that community to balance the technology and not try to stop that, because that ain't happening, but make sure we don't lose the traditional side as well, right? I do believe there is some sort of balance to strike there, and we do need to acknowledge that at its core, this is about the intrinsic, instinctual activity that is fishing and managing yourself in nature in general, right? Hunting is also the same approach. Once we lose that and it all becomes about technology and success, and that's it, I think we've lost a lot of the purpose behind these activities to begin with. So now let's talk about the consumptive argument of forward-facing sonar. So I don't eat fish to begin with. That's why bass fishing is so attractive to me, because I'm not big on anything that comes out of water, frankly. No seafood, no fish oil, none of that. I know it's weird. Outside of the occasional super bright, fresh chrome salmon that I get out of a local river, that I'll take home. That's good stuff. But I got into bass fishing because it is such a catch and release sport. So I don't often think about the consumptive side of things. But the argument is that forward-facing sonar is going to make you so effective that you are now impacting fish populations, right? Now with bass fishing, again, usually catch and release. So it's a little bit less about keeping the fish, but it is an argument about catching more fish will lead to more fish mortality, because there is obviously a mortality rate for all fish when you catch them. They don't all live, right? When you release them, they can swim off, they look totally good and safe, and they might die hours later and you'll never know, right? So there is a certain amount of the fish that you catch, even when you safely release them and do everything properly, they might just die anyway. There's nothing you can do about it sometimes. So if you're catching a whole bunch more bass, then more are theoretically dying, whether you know it or not. The other argument is, and again, I think these are fair arguments. I think it's hard to argue. Any argument to the contrary is a little disingenuous, but you know, the more success you have, the more anglers that are out there getting in front of the fish, successfully finding the fish. Like in my example, in my lake in the winter, I was able to find them and get in front of them. Now you're adding pressure to the fish. You're educating these fish. You're going to make it harder to catch these fish for yourself and for others going forward. And I think that is a reality. You know, the reason that we have these tools, the reason we invest all this money to have these tools is to be more efficient and more effective on the water. It being forward-facing sonar is successful in doing so. It's going to have some impact on your fishery. Again, the question is how much, and is it an acceptable impact? You know, the conversation is about the trade-offs, the boundaries, the gray areas, like where's the line drawn, right? So for those that are out catching a bunch more crappie, that seems to be an argument that I also sympathize with from the fisheries managers. That's where they're keeping an eye on it. And that makes a little bit more sense to me. I do believe, from what I'm hearing from fisheries managers around bass, is like forward-facing sonar is not having a dramatic enough impact to really be particularly concerned. I know that is not every fisheries manager states that, but everything that I'm hearing and reading is more along those lines. Like the massive tournaments that we have they're having a bigger impact on bass populations in terms of mortality from catch and release than your average recreational angler out there even using forward-facing sonar in between these tournaments, right? So it doesn't seem to have risen to a level of concern for the experts at this point. But fisheries like crappie are. Folks are going out and catching their limit more regularly, more quickly than without forward-facing sonar or before forward-facing sonar. And, you know, they're watching that creel rate tick up. So, you know, again, for me, not a huge impact. So I'm a little less personally invested in that. But if that is something that you care deeply about, you might start seeing adjustments in regulations like limits being reduced. You know, hopefully they keep an eye on the bodies of water. I don't know what else to say about that one other than that seems plausible to me, and it is something that technology can potentially have a negative impact on that. I am totally aware that there are various different perspectives on all this stuff. This is controversial for a reason. So I would love to hear your experiences, your perspectives, what you're actually seeing. A lot of this is very new technology, 5, 6, 7 years, however long it's been around is not that long in the scheme of things. So I still think there's lots of data to be gathered, and we're still figuring exactly, you know, it's all inconclusive. So we're figuring out exactly the impact of forward-facing sonar still. So anecdotes, your personal experiences are very interesting and certainly still very relevant at this point. So throw them in the comments. Let me know what you think about all this stuff. I think we're going to leave it there for this one. Again, I'm not trying to stir controversy by any means. In fact, I'm kind of neutral on this stuff, but I am particularly interested in what you all have to say. If you like this video, if you like this style of content, please consider subscribing to the Tag In channel. We have the Tag In Talk podcast, which is stream of consciousness kind of stuff like this, as well as some other a little bit more educational, a little bit more polished videos. But we would love to have you as a subscriber. I hope you all get out there on the water. I hope you have some success. Again, let me know your thoughts. Stay safe, and we'll see you on the next one.